A 62-year-old fisherman from Rockport, Maine, was hauling in his daily catch just after dawn when he noticed something strange entangled in his net. A sealed glass jar, perfectly intact, with something inside that shimmered under the rising sun. No one understood how it had ended up there, nor why it appeared so deliberately preserved. He wiped off the algae-covered surface, squinting through the glass. Inside, tightly rolled and aged with time, was what appeared to be a handwritten letter. When he opened it later that morning, his hands trembled. The contents were not only authentic, they described something nearly unbelievable. By the time authorities confirmed its legitimacy and the fisherman followed the letter's instructions, what they found beneath the earth left everyone speechless. Would you have dared to open that jar? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories that challenge what you think is possible, subscribe for more just like this. Kenneth "Ken" Whitaker had fished the cold waters of Penobscot Bay for over 40 years. At 62, he was well known in the Rockport community, a quiet man with calloused hands, deep laugh lines, and a gaze that carried decades of ocean sunrises. His small boat, the Lydia May, named after his late wife, was as much a part of him as his weather-beaten cap. Ken was the kind of fisherman who rarely missed a morning. Through fog, rain, or snow, he was out before dawn, pulling his traps and lines with the slow precision of a man who had done the same thing more times than he could count. That Tuesday morning in early October seemed no different. The sun was barely a smudge behind a sheet of gray clouds, and the sea was calm, with the soft hush of waves slapping against the hull. Ken had just pulled his fourth trap when he noticed something odd. At first it looked like a rock had gotten tangled in the mesh, or maybe an old bottle. But as he leaned over, something glinted faintly among the seaweed. A rounded shape, smooth and unmistakably man-made. He hoisted it out slowly. It was a glass jar, maybe 10 inches tall and sealed with a heavy wax ring over a rusted metal lid. The glass was thick and greenish, flecked with bubbles, clearly old. Inside, tightly rolled and yellowed by time, was what appeared to be a piece of paper, pressed tightly against the curve of the jar. Ken held it in his gloved hands for a long moment, squinting, unsure what he was looking at. He placed it gently in the boat beside the rest of his catch and kept working, though his eyes kept drifting back to it. It wasn't the first strange thing he'd pulled from the sea, an old doll's head, a broken sextant, even a prosthetic limb once, but this felt different, deliberate, preserved. Back at the dock, he rinsed the jar with fresh water and tried to pry the lid open. It wouldn't budge. The wax had hardened into something like stone. He debated breaking the jar, but something stopped him. Instead, he carried it home and set it on his kitchen table. Ken's house was a modest clapboard place, the kind of home where every corner told a story. He made himself coffee, then sat down and stared at the jar again. With the edge of a fillet knife, he began carefully scraping the wax ring. It came off in flakes. After nearly half an hour of work, the lid gave a sudden pop, releasing a faint, musty smell, old paper and salt. He reached in with tweezers and pulled out the rolled sheet. The paper was brittle, discolored with age, but the writing was legible, painstaking cursive in faded brown ink. At the top was a date, March 3rd, 1933. Below it a title, "To whomever may find this." Ken frowned, unfolding it fully. It was a letter, but not just a letter. It was a confession, a set of directions, a map of sorts. The writer, whose name was scribbled illegibly at the bottom, claimed to have buried a crate of monetary and cultural value near an abandoned barn in a coastal clearing outside of Owl's Head, just 10 miles south of Rockport. The note described landmarks that no longer existed: an old stone wall, a solitary pine, a dried-up well. But as Ken read and reread the text, his breath caught in his throat. The letter didn't just describe where, it described why. The man claimed he'd been involved in laundering money from a failed Prohibition-era smuggling operation. The treasure, he wrote, was hidden in haste after federal agents raided the docks. It had never been retrieved because the man was later imprisoned. He ended the letter with a plea: "If this is found, may the finder use it to restore what was lost. The burden has lingered too long in my blood." Ken leaned back in his chair, heart thudding. His first instinct was skepticism. It had to be a hoax, a fantasy from someone with too much time on their hands. But the paper felt authentic. The handwriting matched the period. The ink had bled just enough to seem like it had aged with the jar. And more than that, there was a part of Ken that wanted to believe. He spent the rest of the day researching. He called the local historical society, trying to verify some of the place names mentioned in the letter. To his astonishment, several matched old property records from the 1930s. There had been a barn where the letter said, "The stone wall once divided two farms that were later absorbed into a wildlife reserve." The more Ken dug, the harder it became to dismiss, and something deeper stirred in him, an ache he hadn't named in years. Since Lydia had passed, he had gone through life like a man underwater. Fishing kept him afloat, but nothing had made him feel awake, until now. The next morning, he packed a thermos of coffee, a shovel, a handheld GPS, and drove down to Owl's Head. The area had changed. What was once farmland was now dense thickets and overgrown trails. But with the letter clutched in one hand, Ken followed its directions as best he could. He found the old stone wall first, just a low moss-covered ridge barely visible under the brush. Further on, where the barn had once stood, was now a wide clearing, filled with shoulder-high grass and broken tree limbs. He walked the perimeter slowly, measuring with his steps, cross-referencing each note on the letter. At the edge of the clearing was the well. It had collapsed, just a ring of stones now, filled with dirt and roots. Ken stood beside it, rereading the last lines of the letter. 20 paces west of the well, beneath the black earth, under cedar bark and stone. He marked his spot and counted his steps. At 20 paces he paused. His hand trembled slightly as he set the GPS aside and gripped the shovel. The earth was dense but not impossible. After the third shovelful, he hit something hard. His breath caught. He knelt and began scraping with his hands. Beneath a layer of packed roots was a flat slab of rock. He pried it up, heart pounding. Underneath was wood. Old, splintered and water-stained, but unmistakably a box. Ken stared at it, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. He glanced around instinctively, as if someone might be watching. He lifted the box slowly. It was heavier than he expected. He set it down gently and opened the lid. Inside, neatly arranged and wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks of old currency, bills printed in the early 1900s, large denominations. Alongside them were bundles of silver coins, and at the very bottom, what looked like a leather-bound journal and a metal tin. Ken didn't speak. He simply sat back and let out a long breath, staring at the impossible contents. By the time he made it back to his truck, the sun had begun to set. He locked the box in his back seat and drove home, mind spinning with questions. What had he just found? How much was it worth? And more importantly, was he even allowed to keep it? Ken wasn't a reckless man. The next morning, he contacted a lawyer he trusted, a woman named Harriet Cobb, who had handled his fishing permits and property taxes for years. He brought her the letter and photographs of the site. After reading everything, she looked up at him with wide eyes. "You may have just stumbled into something extraordinary," she said quietly. "But we need to do this the right way." Over the next week, Ken's life transformed. Legal processes began. The treasure was assessed, cataloged, and carefully analyzed for historical value. Experts confirmed that many of the currency bills were still redeemable and rare enough to fetch enormous value at auction. The silver was genuine, and the tin contained bearer bonds, some still valid under federal law. Word began to trickle through the local community, but Harriet kept a tight lid on the details. She advised Ken not to speak publicly until everything was verified and registered through the proper authorities. Still, whispers floated around Rockport. People speculated. Someone had seen Ken buying a new pair of boots or a better icebox for the Lydia May. He hadn't changed much, but there was a gleam in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a lightness in his step. But even as the legalities unfolded, something else began to weigh on him, because the journal found in the bottom of the box held more than just numbers and notes. It held names, locations, transactions, clues about other caches possibly hidden along the Maine coast, mentions of secondary drops and safe holdings. Ken sat on his porch many nights, the journal in his lap, unsure whether to pursue what came next. After all, lightning rarely strikes twice. But sometimes, the sea gives back more than just fish. Harriet Cobb had never seen anything like it. Sitting across from Ken in her office lined with legal books and nautical charts, she turned the aged leather journal in her gloved hands, her brows furrowed in deep thought. "There's a pattern here," she murmured, flipping through pages of slanted, inky script, sketched coastlines, and codes that seemed at once familiar and cryptic. This isn't just a treasure note, it's a ledger. And if what I'm seeing is accurate, this wasn't a one-time stash. Ken didn't respond immediately. He was still absorbing the last few days. Appraisers coming and going, state officials delicately questioning him about maritime salvage rights, historians marveling at the condition of the items. The sealed jar had already been collected for preservation, and the letter had been digitally scanned for documentation. He'd begun the process of formally declaring the find through Maine's abandoned property laws, and initial valuations placed the discovered treasure somewhere between $2.6 and $3 million. But none of that explained the journal. One page in particular troubled him, a crudely drawn map that stretched along the coast, with X's marked in different coves and inlets, some of which Ken recognized. One of them, marked with a small symbol, a fish, was no more than 15 minutes from where he had dropped his nets just days before. "I've fished near there for decades," he said softly, pointing. "Never thought twice about it." Harriet looked up. "Would you go back?" Ken stared at the map, then at her. "I don't know." She didn't push, but something in her gaze said she knew what was already decided. The following Saturday, Ken returned to the site with a small crew from the Maine Historical Preservation Office. This time, the clearing was no longer quiet. Tape had been placed around the original dig site. Surveying equipment dotted the area, and voices echoed between the trees as professionals cataloged every fragment of wood, fabric, and metal found in the soil. Ken stood to the side, arms crossed, unsure whether he felt proud or invaded. One of the historians, a young woman named Eleanor, approached him, holding a fragment of paper inside a plastic slip. "We found this under the crate. It's from the same journal paper stock," she said. "It looks like it tore from a page that was never meant to be found." He glanced down. The writing was faint, but legible. "If this is taken, the others must not remain. The trail ends only when no trace remains. TL." Ken's mouth went dry. The others. For the next several days, he couldn't sleep. That night, sitting in his kitchen, he spread out the scanned pages of the journal, the maps, the list of locations, the odd references to stones that speak and coves that swallow sound. The cryptic language gnawed at him, even as he tried to ignore the deeper pull, the same pull that had compelled him to dig up that first box. But his instincts, those hardened, sea-weathered instincts, told him something simple. This wasn't over. Not even close. The next morning, without telling anyone, Ken took the legitimacy out before dawn. The air was sharp, the water like glass. He followed the route drawn on the map in the journal to the spot marked with the fish. As the sun rose, he drifted slowly near the shoreline, eyes scanning every inch. And then, just after 7 a.m., he saw it, a pile of rocks near the base of a cliff, strangely uniform. In the center, what looked like the decayed remnant of a carved post, now no more than a splintered stump. It was almost invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look, but to Ken, it was like it had been waiting for him. He anchored the boat and rowed in with a small dinghy. The tide was low, exposing the rocky base of the cliff. He climbed up carefully, watching his step. The pile was older than the first site, but it had clearly been disturbed at some point, perhaps by storms, or someone who had been here before. Still, Ken got on his knees and began to dig. It didn't take long. After about 40 minutes of clawing through sand and rock, his fingers struck wood. He paused, looked around. No one was there. He uncovered a second box, smaller than the first, but bound in rusted iron. This time, the lid didn't creak. It opened easily. Inside was something unexpected. Bundles of letters, dozens of them, all written in the same hand as the original letter in the jar, each sealed with wax, labeled with dates from 1929 to 1935, some addressed to names, others simply marked with code phrases like Night Market or Harbor 17. Ken's hands trembled as he picked one up and broke the seal. The contents were damning. This was no simple smuggler's loot. These letters contained detailed financial records, names of officials, some still recognizable, and elaborate instructions for the movement of money and goods through Maine's coast, all linked to an underground network that had survived well beyond prohibition. Ken felt a chill. He realized this wasn't just about treasure anymore. This was about history, a hidden history, written in ink and buried to protect something bigger than money. He took only 3 letters, resealed the box, and reburied it. For now. Back in Rockport, he went to Harriet. She read the letters in stunned silence. Then slowly she whispered, "You can't show these to just anyone." "Why?" Ken asked. "Because if these names are real, if these connections still exist, then what you've uncovered might not be safe." Ken blinked. "You think someone might come after it?" "I think someone might already know you found it," Harriet said. "And that changes everything." That night, Ken noticed a dark sedan parked across from his house. Unfamiliar. Engine off. Lights off. By morning, it was gone. 2 days later, someone attempted to break into his boathouse. Nothing was taken. But the locks were cut. And then the calls started. Private numbers, hang-ups. Ken installed cameras. Harriet doubled the legal protections on the treasure claim. But even still, the feeling settled over Rockport like a fog. Something had been disturbed. And whoever had buried that jar may have done so for more than just hiding money. One evening, Eleanor from the preservation office called. "You need to come see this," she said. He met her at the university lab, where the original letter and journal were being analyzed. She pointed to the back of the journal's cover, now revealed under UV light. Scrawled faintly, almost invisible under normal lighting, were 5 words. "You shouldn't have found this." Ken's mouth went dry. "Is it recent?" "No," Eleanor said. "It's been there all along." Ken left the lab without speaking. The wind bit at his coat as he walked back to his truck. By the time he sat in the cab, his mind was spinning. What had he started? The treasure was real. The money was real. But the story behind it was only beginning to unfold. And not all of it wanted to be found. As this story deepens, we have to ask, what would you do if you found a sealed jar with a buried secret? Would you follow the clues? Would you dig? Or would you leave it alone, not knowing what might be waiting? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. Seriously, we want to know what part of the world you're hearing this story in. And if you want to find out what Ken discovers next, and trust us, it only gets stranger, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that blur the line between truth and legend, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss what's buried beneath the surface. Because in Rockport, the sea has more secrets than anyone knew. By the 3rd week after the discovery, the small town of Rockport had begun to feel the shift, like a subtle undertow pulling at the edges of daily life. Tourists were thinning with the chill of approaching winter, but a new stream of visitors had arrived. Government representatives, maritime law specialists, historians, and treasure hunters hoping for a glimpse of the site. Ken Whitaker, once just another name down at the harbor, was now a figure of whispered speculation. The Maine Historical Preservation Office had taken the lead on the investigation. Dr. Lawrence Berman, a professor of history from Bowdoin College with a background in Prohibition-era smuggling, was appointed to lead the archival review. When he met Ken, he shook his hand firmly and said, "You may have just rewritten a chapter of coastal American history." On a gray Thursday morning, a formal search was authorized for the newly marked location on the map, just one of several that the journal hinted might hold more than just whispers of the past. This second site, located in a rocky inlet off the coast near Thomaston, required more than just a shovel. Divers were brought in. Ken stood beside Harriet on the cliffs above, watching as the team of 3 geared up in dry suits and descended slowly into the freezing Atlantic. The dive took nearly 2 hours. Ken could feel his stomach twist with every minute. He'd grown used to the rhythm of the ocean, but this was different. This was a breach into something old, sealed, and very possibly dangerous. When the divers resurfaced, they were shouting. Hauling up a waterlogged chest using winches from the boat, they wrestled it onto the deck and radioed the shore team. The box was similar in design to the first, iron-bound, cedar-lined, and sealed in pitch, but far more eroded. As the lid cracked open under cautious hands, a salty vapor rose into the air. Inside, cushioned in decaying felt and oilcloth, was a collection of artifacts that made even Dr. Berman take a step back. "Are those?" one of the assistants began. "Yes," Berman replied. "They are." There were handguns, 38 caliber Colts, each stamped with a manufacture date from the early 1930s, a brass spyglass, 2 ledgers with coded notations, and beneath it all, a tin canister containing faded photographs bundled with a ribbon. One image, cracked and curling, showed 3 men standing on a dock beside wooden crates. 2 wore fedoras. The third wore a badge. On the back was written, "Spring 33, Jonesport transfer." Berman's expression shifted. He examined the handwriting, the photo stock, the equipment. Then, quietly, he muttered, "This doesn't make sense. This shouldn't be here." He turned to Ken. "You said this was just a fisherman's journal, but this is organized. These are drops, arms, money, records. This is a network. Someone was archiving this deliberately." As the items were cataloged and packed for preservation, a wave of unease settled over the group. These weren't just relics. They were the bones of something bigger, something that had been hidden on purpose. The question wasn't whether it was real. It was why it had remained secret for nearly a century. Later that evening, back in the temporary HQ set up inside an old boathouse in Rockport, Dr. Berman gathered the team. "I've been reviewing the journal again," he said, "and I think we've misunderstood its purpose. This wasn't just a trail of buried treasure. This was a failsafe." He placed the open journal on the table. A sketch showed a coastal map with marks in the shape of a triangle between Rockport, Thomaston, and Monhegan Island. "If you overlay this with smuggling routes active during the last years of Prohibition," Berman continued, "you'll find perfect alignment. What we've found so far isn't just storage, it's a system. Someone, probably multiple people, designed this to hide everything connected to a failed operation. But not just hide it, archive it." Harriet narrowed her eyes. "Why?" Berman tapped the photo of the man with the badge. "Because some of them were law enforcement. And this," he gestured to the guns and ledgers, "this would have destroyed them." Ken leaned forward. "So you think they buried all this to protect their reputations? Or their lives?" Berman said. One of the younger assistants, a man named Nolan, chimed in. "Could this be connected to the Black Channel cases?" The room went silent. The Black Channel was a term whispered in certain corners of Maine's criminal archives, an unconfirmed network of underground exchanges between bootleggers, corrupt police, and wealthy financiers during the waning days of Prohibition. It was largely considered conspiracy theory. No solid evidence had ever been uncovered. Until now. Berman didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at Ken. "Where did you find the jar again?" Ken hesitated. "Caught in a lobster trap. Same spot I've been setting for years." Berman nodded. "That spot sits directly on the old line between Owl's Head and Monhegan freight runs." "You're saying the jar was placed there?" Harriet asked. "I'm saying," Berman replied slowly, "that someone knew exactly where to drop it, and they hoped someone, like Ken, would eventually find it." That night, Ken drove home in silence. The town was quiet, lights glowing behind drawn curtains. At home, he poured a glass of whiskey and sat by the window. On the table beside him lay the remaining pages of the journal, many still unexamined. He flipped through until one caught his eye. It wasn't a map or a ledger. It was a letter, unsent, perhaps never meant to be mailed. It read, "To the next honest man of the sea, if you read this, then the tide has turned. What we buried was never meant to be found until all who touched it were gone. If you dig further, know that eyes may still watch. But if you do nothing, then we buried it in vain. Signed only." L.R. Ken stared at it for a long time. Outside, the wind picked up. Trees shifted in the dark. He looked down at the name, L.R. The initials didn't match any name in the town records he'd seen, but they weren't entirely unfamiliar. He crossed to his bookshelf and pulled down a town ledger from 1934, something he'd purchased years ago at an estate sale, more for the nautical charts than the records. Flipping through, he found it. Lawrence Remick, listed as a customs agent and part-time sheriff's deputy. Disappeared 1935. Case unresolved. Ken exhaled. So the man who wrote the journal had been a lawman, and he'd vanished shortly after the last entry. He picked up the journal again. On the final page, written faintly in pencil, was a phrase, "Monhegan knows. The island." Ken had fished near Monhegan often, but rarely landed. It was wild, stark, a place known more for its isolation than its secrets. But if the journal was right, it was the final point in the triangle. He knew what had to be done, but the real question wasn't if he would go. It was who else already knew. Monhegan Island rose from the Atlantic like a forgotten shard of time, windswept, weathered, and silent. The 9-mile ferry ride from the mainland brought few comforts, and as Ken stepped off the small transport with the journal wrapped in plastic under his arm, he felt the weight of the past settle heavily on his shoulders. The island wasn't empty. Artists, recluses, and a handful of families called it home. But on a mid-November morning with the fog curling like smoke between pine trunks and old shingles, it felt like he'd landed in another era. He met with the island's part-time constable, a wiry man in his 60s named Paul Cray, who listened carefully as Ken explained why he'd come. "We don't get many folks chasing ghosts out here," Paul said with a raised brow. "But we've got enough of our own to go around." Ken showed him the journal, pointing to the line that read, "Monaghan knows." Paul nodded slowly. "There's an old storehouse on the South Cliffs, been locked up since the 40s, belonged to the Calder family, ran goods for decades, legal and not. If there's something out here worth hiding, it's either under that building or buried near it." With permission granted and a member of the island council observing, Ken and Paul hiked to the site. The cliffs were steep, wind-whipped, and edged by seagrass. Perched 30 feet back from the drop was a small wooden building, half collapsed and gray with age. A rusted padlock clung uselessly to the doorframe. Inside was a mess: crates, broken bottles, fragments of lantern glass. Ken's flashlight caught a faint shimmer under the floorboards. A latch. He dropped to his knees and pulled back the planks. A set of rotted steps descended into darkness. "Stay here," he told Paul, who nodded but kept the radio ready. The cellar was damp and cold. The beam of his flashlight flickered against stone walls. Then, in the far corner, something caught his eye: a metal drum, sealed tight, and behind it, another crate, buried halfway in the dirt. Ken approached slowly, kneeling. He brushed off the soil and pried the lid loose. Inside were stacks of envelopes, stamped with official seals, some federal, some marked confidential. There were identification cards, half-burnt ledgers, and a stack of legal documents referencing bank accounts that no longer existed. Tucked into one envelope was a folded map, hand-drawn with 4 red dots, one near Rockport, one near Thomaston, one where he now stood, and one much farther south, Rhode Island. At the bottom of the crate was a small steel box. He opened it. Inside, to his shock, was a diamond-encrusted pocket watch, a ring with a Masonic emblem, and an old banknote for $25,000, unredeemed. Ken froze. He wasn't looking at a simple smuggler's cache. This was evidence of deals, cover-ups, possibly even crimes that had remained buried for decades. He carried the steel box upstairs and showed Paul. The constable stared for a long time. "Some of these names," he whispered, pointing to one of the documents. "They're not just local. These are people who served in office. Bank executives. This," he trailed off, "this wasn't meant to be found." Back on the mainland, Harriet's office became the epicenter of what now resembled a federal inquiry. Lawyers debated ownership. Historians debated authenticity. But one thing became clear. Ken had uncovered not only a monetary fortune, but a trove of historically significant documents tied to one of the most elusive criminal networks of the 1930s. Some of the bonds were still redeemable. The pocket watch alone was worth over $70,000. Combined, the artifacts from the 3 sites had been conservatively valued at nearly $5 million. Ken was now officially a millionaire. But the windfall came with pressure. Reporters showed up at his dock. Strangers approached him in grocery stores. Offers came in for books, interviews, even a documentary. But Ken remained quiet, because what haunted him wasn't what he'd found. It was what he hadn't. The final red dot on the map, the one in Rhode Island, bothered him. It wasn't labeled. No coordinates, no description. Just a symbol, drawn in red. An open eye. When he showed it to Dr. Berman, the historian's face went pale. "I've seen that before," he said. "In FBI files. It's called the Eye of Penance. It was a code used by internal investigators tracking corruption cases. When they marked it, it meant the site was active. A surveillance point, or a trap. It also meant someone was watching." "Watching who?" Ken asked. Berman hesitated. "Everyone." Back at home, Ken sat with the journal in front of him. Only a few pages remained. The last entry was dated March 8, 1935. It read, "If this reaches you, it means the last door has been opened. I leave you with knowledge, not burden. But beware. Those who see the full picture rarely sleep easy. Some things were never meant to surface. I see that now. The eye remains. Let it close." Ken looked at the map again. The red eye burned like a warning. What did it mean? Was the 4th site a continuation of the archive? Or something darker? Something left as a warning to those who searched too deep? He wasn't sure. And for the first time since this began, he didn't know if he wanted to find out. Yet even as he locked the documents in a bank vault and filed final claims, the questions refused to leave him. Why did the journal end there? Why had no one come for it before? And perhaps most troubling, who had sealed that jar and placed it just where he'd find it? Because nothing about this felt like coincidence anymore. Someone had known this would happen. And maybe, just maybe, someone was still watching. Would you follow the trail? Would you open that fourth site, not knowing what might be buried there, or who might be waiting? Tell us in the comments what you would do. And if you've been watching this far, drop a comment with your location. Where in the world are you hearing Ken's story? Like this video if it's pulled you into the mystery. Subscribe so you don't miss the next piece of this puzzle. And remember, sometimes the sea buries more than it should, but every now and then, it gives something back. Ken never returned to the fourth red dot. Weeks passed. Snow came early to Rockport that year, blanketing the harbor in silence. The Lydia May stayed moored longer than usual, rocking gently under a sky that refused to clear. Inside his home, Ken tried to resume a normal rhythm. Coffee at dawn, knots in rope, weather reports crackling from the old radio. But the normalcy rang hollow. The fortune had changed everything. His bank account was full. His name was in papers across New England. People nodded at him differently on the docks. But it wasn't pride he felt when they looked at him. It was distance. Harriet had done her best to protect him legally. The treasure was officially processed, its provenance affirmed by state and federal bodies. Items with historical significance were donated under his name to museums and archives. The money from the redeemable bonds and auctioned valuables was clean, unquestioned. But the story behind it all remained untouched, unresolved. Because deep down, Ken believed something hadn't ended. He still had the journal. He still had the map. And that final mark, the eye, called to him in the quietest hours when wind howled through the eaves and he caught himself staring out to sea like it might speak. Then one morning, a letter arrived. No return address, no postage, just a folded envelope placed inside his mailbox by hand. Inside, a single card. On the front, the image of an antique key. On the back, 2 lines handwritten in perfect looping cursive. We bury secrets to protect the living, not the dead. You found 3. Leave the 4th. Ken sat down hard in his kitchen chair, the note trembling between his fingers. He scanned it for clues. The paper was modern, the ink fresh. But the message? That was old. Not in years, but in tone. It had the weight of a warning from someone who knew more than they let on. He showed it to Harriet. She brought in a security consultant who had helped with another treasure recovery case years ago. The man analyzed the handwriting, the paper fibers, the ink composition. His report was short. Whoever wrote this wanted to be found just enough. Not to be traced, but to be understood. Berman was less cryptic. This confirms it, he said. You've touched something generational, institutional. That 4th location. It wasn't just a drop site. It was the root. He laid out photocopies of additional documents found in the Monhegan archive. One letter, dated 1936, referenced opposition forces trying to eliminate witnesses. Another noted a final ledger being moved out of reach, road territory under the eye. Ken leaned back, breathing slowly. So, what happens if I go? Berman didn't answer. Neither did Harriet. That night, Ken drove down to the harbor. He walked the length of the dock, boots crunching over ice. The Lydia May swayed at its post, silent as ever. He stood there for an hour, looking out over the dark water, and then he made his decision. He didn't tell anyone. 3 days later, Ken was gone. No note, no calls, no bank activity, just a single tracker ping from a gas station in Connecticut, and then silence. Weeks passed. The media speculated. Headlines returned briefly to the Fisherman Millionaire, now missing. The authorities did not open an investigation. Harriet, citing his age and recent exposure to intense scrutiny, suggested he had taken a break, perhaps gone off-grid. He needed quiet, she told one reporter. You can't hear the past if there's too much noise. But back in Rockport, something strange happened. 3 different fishermen, all friends of Ken, reported seeing his boat at sea near sunrise, unmanned, drifting quietly under power as if someone had set the engine, then vanished. Each time, by the time they approached, it was gone. When investigators searched the Lydia May's dock slip, they found the mooring rope intact. No signs of forced departure. Yet the sightings continued. Locals started to whisper about a man who followed a map too far, about a trail that didn't want to be walked, about an eye that watched and remembered. One morning, months later, Harriet received a package at her office. Inside, the original journal, returned, with a new page inserted at the back, handwritten in the same careful script as the one found in Ken's mailbox. It read, "The fourth door opens inward. Some truths do not shine when brought to light. They burn. No signature, just a symbol. The eye, now closed." Harriet never spoke publicly about the letter. She had it stored quietly in a private archive. But she told Berman, and Berman in turn told one journalist, quietly, off the record. And that journalist, well, that's how you're hearing this story now. So what do you think? Did Ken find the final site? Did he uncover something so big, so deeply rooted in the machinery of old power and buried networks, that it had to be erased? Or did he finally step into the mystery he'd chased and choose never to return? We may never know. But what we do know is this: a sealed jar, a yellowed letter, and a fisherman's choice unraveled nearly a century of hidden history. And somewhere, beneath our feet, or perhaps drifting just offshore, more secrets still sleep. Would you follow the trail? Would you dig? Or would you leave it to the waves? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear what you would have done. And if you followed Ken's journey from the first cast of his net to the last page of the journal, you know this story isn't over. It's only resting. So be sure to like this video, drop a comment, and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe for more real-life mysteries that challenge what we know, what we're told, and what lies just beneath the surface. And don't forget to turn on notifications, because the next time the sea gives something back, you'll want to be the first to know. We'll be watching and waiting for the next sealed jar to rise.